The German soldiers in the line did not know his face. They didn't know his voice, his laugh, or the way he chewed out his own officers when they failed his standards. All they knew was a name that began to pass through the trenches and bunkers like a dark rumor, the way men spoke about particularly bad sectors of the front. A name attached to divisions that attacked when no one else would, that came at night, that crossed rivers in the dark and turned what should have been quiet, miserable hours into a haunted blur of flares and muzzle flashes. They called him Terrible Terry Allen. On paper, he was just another American division commander, one more general in the swelling Allied machine, grinding its way toward the Reich. But in the field, for the men who actually had to face his soldiers, Allen became something else, the symbol of a new kind of American opponent. One who refused to play by the comfortable rhythms of war, who did not respect night as a time of rest, who made green divisions fight like hardened veterans from the very first shot. To understand why German soldiers came to fear him, it is not enough to list the battles he won or the distances his divisions advanced. You have to understand the man himself, how he thought, what he valued, what he refused to tolerate, and then see the war through the eyes of the men on the other side of his line. The story begins, as so many American military stories do, with a boy who never really had a chance to be anything except a soldier. Terry de la Mesa Allen was born on April 5th, 1888, inside the walls of Fort Douglas in the Utah Territory. While most children of that era first opened their eyes under a farmhouse roof or in a small-town bedroom, Terry's first sights were parade grounds, barracks, and army stables. His father wore a uniform. His grandfather had worn one at Gettysburg. The idea that one could choose a different life would have seemed almost strange to him. For the Allens, the army wasn't a job. It was the family business. His childhood was a tour of American frontier posts. He learned to ride because there were horses. He learned to shoot because there were rifles. The cavalry culture of those days valued toughness and directness. You didn't impress people with perfect posture or polished brass. You impressed them by staying in the saddle when everyone else was exhausted, by still being in the line after everyone else had peeled away. From that world, Terry Allen absorbed one simple principle. A soldier's worth had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with how he behaved when things got hard. The American army of the old frontier lived closer to death and discomfort than the polished peacetime force between the world wars. Long marches, low pay, crude posts scattered across hostile country, that was the reality. It left young Terry with a lifelong distrust of anything that looked like empty ceremony. To him, the only discipline that mattered was what happened when people were scared, tired, and in danger. That belief would put him on a collision course with a very different institution, the United States Military Academy at West Point. West Point was supposed to be the crown jewel of an officer's career. For the Allen family, Terry's appointment in 1907 was the fulfillment of generations of tradition. But if the Frontier Army had been built around horses and grit, West Point was built around equations and precision. Its grey stone walls contained an obsession with mathematics, engineering, and theoretical gunnery. The academy took restless young men and tried to sand off every rough edge. Terry Allen did not sand easily. He was energetic, impatient, full of motion. Sitting still in a classroom felt like punishment. His tongue betrayed him too. He stuttered when reciting in front of instructors, adding embarrassment to frustration. Demerits piled up for minor rule violations. He started to attract mocking nicknames. One of them, Tear Around the Mess Hall Allen, captured his whole problem in a single phrase. He wasn't built for quiet conformity. He was built for movement. West Point's answer was simple. It expelled him for academic failure. In the neat lines of an officer register, that should have been the end. Dismissed, United States Military Academy, 1911. But if there was one constant in Terry Allen's character, it was his refusal to accept official verdicts as the final word. When a door closed, he did not sit down and sulk. He looked for windows. He finished a degree at Catholic University instead, then leveraged that into a commission in the cavalry in 1912. He had not entered through the sacred front gate of West Point, but he was in uniform. It would not be the last time he reached his objective by a route that infuriated the people guarding the main road. His first taste of real danger came on the Mexican border, where tensions flared regularly. In 1913, he found himself riding with 6 troopers when they made contact with roughly 30 rustlers who had slipped north with stolen cattle. Doctrine, caution, and common sense all said the same thing. Shadow them, call for reinforcements, avoid getting your little detachment wiped out. Allen attacked. It was a minor action on the map of history, but a major entry in Allen's personal playbook. By moving aggressively, he seized surprise and momentum. His tiny force scattered or captured the rustlers. The lesson soaked into his bones. Audacity, applied at the right moment, could bend odds that looked impossible on paper. A few years later, the entire world erupted. When the United States entered the First World War in 1917, Allen burned with the same fierce hunger most young officers felt, the need to prove himself in combat before the fighting ended. At first, luck seemed to mock him. He was assigned not to a frontline infantry regiment, but to an ammunition train, the unglamorous backbone that fed shells to the big guns. Necessary work, but not the stuff of glory. Eventually, though, he was given command of an infantry battalion and sent into the nightmare battlefields of France, Saint-Mihiel, and then the Meuse-Argonne. There, amid mud, artillery, machine guns, and tangled wire, he discovered the thing that would make him famous and feared a generation later. He discovered the power of the night. The manuals and senior officers taught a simple rhythm. Attack during the day, when you could see and control your men. Dig in at night. Darkness was treated as an enemy. Units got lost. Orders vanished in the confusion. Friendly fire incidents shredded relations between neighboring regiments. Staff officers far behind the line imagined nighttime as a void that swallowed their carefully drawn arrows on the map. Allen, unlike many of those staff officers, was close enough to the front to see what daylight attacks really cost. Men rising from trenches into clear morning light under the eyes of German machine gun crews. Plan after plan smashed into the same belts of fire. Advances measured in yards and paid for with lists of names. When circumstances forced night operations, when timing or opportunity left no choice, Allen noticed the difference. Casualties dropped. Chaos didn't vanish, but it was shared. German machine gunners no longer had clear targets. Their artillery observers couldn't see precise adjustments. Defensive lines that were deadly at noon felt oddly brittle at midnight. He began to experiment. Reconnoiter by day, strike by night. Keep the plan brutally simple. Make sure every platoon leader knew the objective and the route, not just the officers huddled over the map. avoid complex timing that depended on perfect coordination, use whistles, flares, and prearranged signals that could cut through confusion. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't polished, but it worked. The Germans on the other side of the line had no reason to remember the name of some obscure American battalion commander in 1918. But Terry Allen remembered them. He remembered how they reacted when they were hit in the dark. He remembered the panic in their fire, the scattered shouts in a language he had studied out of professional curiosity. Most of all, he remembered the numbers. Fewer of his own men died when he attacked the way the manuals warned against. On October 24, 1918, during one of those assaults, a German machine gun found him. Bullets tore into his face. Medics tagged him for evacuation. He argued, cajoled, refused to go. Bandaged and bloodied, he stayed with his men. They watched their commander literally bleeding and still moving forward. It forged a bond that would follow him into the next war. Officers who asked others to take risks they themselves avoided disgusted him. He would never be one of them. By the time the guns fell silent on November 11th, Allen had a reputation as brave, aggressive, and a bit reckless, had decorations. He had scars, and he had a theory about the dark that he would spend the next 25 years refining against an enemy that did learn his name. The years between the wars looked, from the outside, like stagnation. The army shrank from millions to a skeleton force. Ambitious officers watched promotion lists stand still. Terry Allen used those years as a laboratory. He remained a cavalryman in a world drifting away from horses. He rode in savage endurance contests, testing how long he could stay in the saddle. He played fierce, bruising polo. He studied German doctrine and the changing shape of war, reading about tanks and radios and stormtrooper tactics developed by the very army he suspected America would face again. He never lost his contempt for empty spit and polish. He also never lost his obsession with training. Units under his influence drilled hard. He pushed realistic field problems whenever he could, even when budgets were tight and senior officers preferred tidy parades to muddy exercises. To men who served under him in the 1920s and 1930s, he was already dividing the world into two categories: those who treated soldiering like a checklist of forms, and those who treated it like practice for a coming storm. That storm broke in Europe first. Poland, France, the Low Countries, all fell beneath an enemy that moved faster and hit harder than most planners had believed possible. The Wehrmacht wrote a new reputation for itself in blood and cities and wrecked armies. The Americans watched. Some took comfort in distance. Others, like Allen, saw something else, a test that would eventually be theirs. When the United States finally began expanding its forces, the Chief of Staff, George C. Marshall, went hunting for fighters. Marshall was not seduced by sharp uniforms. He wanted men who could command in the field, who had tasted real combat, who would not freeze the first time things went wrong. On Marshall's desk, Terry Allen's record did not look clean. Failed out of West Point, known to drink, known to use language that did not sound good in polished headquarters settings. But Marshall also saw something harder to quantify: a pattern of effectiveness. A man who had fought in 1918, who had turned theory into something practical in the mud. Marshall made a decision that left some of his own staff muttering. He pulled Allen straight from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general, skipping the rank of colonel entirely. Promotions like that didn't happen by accident. It was a bet that the rough, restless cavalryman could become exactly the sort of leader the new American army would need. 2 years later, that bet was tested off the coast of North Africa. In May 1942, Terry Allen took command of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One. It was the oldest division in the U.S. Army, rich in tradition, proud of its history. Under Allen, that history became less about old campaigns and more about something immediate. He forbade parade ground polish if it interfered with combat readiness. He talked to privates as if their opinions mattered, because when you intend to ask men to crawl forward under fire, their opinions about what works are not trivia. When the division landed near Oran in November 1942 as part of Operation Torch, Allen went with them into the fire. The Germans and Italians opposing them soon learned that while American units might be inexperienced in that theatre, some of their commanders were not. The real test, from the German perspective, came not on those initial beaches, but in the broken, mountainous terrain of Tunisia. There, the Afrika Korps and other veteran elements of the Wehrmacht ran rings around inexperienced Allied units. At Kasserine Pass, panzer forces smashed through American positions, sending some units into a panicked retreat that German officers would later describe with contemptuous satisfaction. Terry Allen's 1st Division was not immune to mistakes. They bled like everyone else. But when the line threatened to disintegrate altogether, Allen was among the men who helped slam a door in Rommel's face at Jebel el Hamra. He directed a counterattack that captured hundreds of prisoners and helped stabilize the situation. For German soldiers who had seen Americans run, it was an unpleasant surprise. Here was a U.S. division that could be hurt, pushed, and knocked down, and still come back swinging. Then came El Gueta in March 1943, the battle that really began to attach Allen's name to a particular kind of American resistance. In that valley, German tanks and infantry attacked the 1st Division, with every expectation that they could crack the line as they had at Kasserine. The Americans were dug in, but exposed. Artillery hammered the positions. Infantry clung to the rocky ground. Tanks pushed forward, looking for weak points. At one point, the German push threatened Allen's own divisional headquarters. Staff officers wanted to pull back to a safer distance. The suggestion was rational. Headquarters were not supposed to be under direct fire. But Allen understood what a rearward move would look like to the exhausted riflemen watching from foxholes and scrub. If they saw the command post packing up and driving away, the impact on morale could be catastrophic. He refused. He stayed in place, making himself very deliberately visible. Trucks did not start up. Maps were not rolled. The message filtered outward with the speed of rumor. The general is still here. He is being shelled, too, and he is not leaving. That stubbornness, more than any line in a field manual, helped the division hold. Anti-tank guns knocked out the panzers. The German assault faltered. For the first time, German tank crews learned that not every American unit would simply break under pressure. To the German High Command, Allen was just one name among many in intercepted messages and intelligence summaries. To the German, soldiers who had to advance under his artillery and against his infantry, the pattern started to matter. Wherever this particular American division showed up, the fighting got harder. When the Big Red One went ashore at Gila in Sicily in July 1943 and then pushed into the interior, that pattern repeated. At Troina, Allen's men were ordered to take a heavily fortified mountain town that anchored German defenses. They attacked, and the Germans counterattacked, once, twice, again, and again. Some accounts count 24 separate counterblows over 6 days. Each time, the 1st Division absorbed the impact, then inched forward again. German officers in their after-action reports noted that the Americans had learned. By the time Troina finally fell, no one on the German side who had fought there thought of Americans as soft anymore. And for some of them, the name attached to the division's commander lodged in memory. Ironically, the higher Allen's reputation rose among his men and his enemies, the more he worried some of his own superiors. He allowed his troops to be loose in the rear. Military police units complained that the 1st Division walked as if rules were optional. Stories about drinking, brawling, and contempt for polished ceremony reached Omar Bradley and Dwight Eisenhower. Time magazine chose that moment to put Terry Allen on its cover, hailing him as a rising star. Behind the scenes, the decision had already been made. Allen would be relieved. Official explanations spoke of discipline, of the need for divisions to look as good as they fought. Bradley later admitted that no one surpassed Allen in the raw ability to lead troops in combat. But for a war that was going to last years, with an army that had to expand dramatically and interact with allies and civilians across multiple countries, they wanted commanders who conformed more closely to the textbook image. Allen, who had walked with his men through shellfire, was sent home. If the story had ended there, the Germans might have remembered the Big Red One's ferocity, but eventually attached it to the faceless idea of American troops. What turned Terry Allen into a name the Wehrmacht genuinely learned to fear was what came next. He came back. In October 1943, now back down to the rank of Brigadier General, he assumed command of the 104th Infantry Division at Camp Adair in Oregon. Unlike the 1st, the 104th had no storied history. Its ranks were filled with clerks, machinists, farm boys, and factory workers. Average age, early 20s. No combat, no reputation. Allen looked at them and saw not what they were, but what they could become. The US Army had a standard recipe for training divisions. So many hours in the classroom, so many hours drilling in formation, 10 to 12 hours a week of tactical exercises, enough on paper to turn civilians into soldiers. Allen threw the standard recipe in the trash. He turned the Timberwolves into his second experiment in turning theory into fear. 30 to 35 hours a week of tactical work, days that started early and ended in darkness, marches through Oregon forests until feet blistered and tempers snapped. And at the center of it all, his obsession, the night. They trained in it, over and over, until the dark stopped feeling like a wall and started feeling like a tool. They practiced moving through trees without flashlights, barely speaking. They learned to use the shape of the land, the outline of ridges and streams, as guides. They rehearsed assaults in which the first time they saw their objective was in the flicker of explosions. Live ammunition cracked the air above their heads. Artillery boomed in the distance. Confusion was intentional. He wanted his soldiers to understand that fear and chaos were not bugs in war. They were features, and that the side which accepted that first would own the battlefield. Other divisions at the camp thought Allen had lost his mind. Timberwolf soldiers stumbled into mess on 3 hours of sleep, mud-streaked and hollow-eyed. But as the months passed, something changed behind those tired eyes. They began to move with a different kind of confidence once the sun went down. The very thing that frightened most units, the prospect of night combat, became their comfort zone. When the 104th finally reached Europe in 1944 and took its place on the line near the German border, German intelligence looked at the file and saw exactly what Allen wanted them to see: a green American division, straight from the States, no combat record, easy meat. The veterans of the Wehrmacht dug in along rivers and in forests with the casual cruelty of men who had broken fresh enemy formations before. They expected clumsy daylight probes, slow learning curves, and the familiar pattern of American dependence on artillery and air power. Instead, on the night of October 23, 1944, they encountered something else. The first Timberwolf attacks came in the dark. Small American units slipped across no man's land with almost no warning. Patrols vanished. Outposts that had seemed secure in daylight were overrun in minutes. Grenades bounced into dugouts. Germans scrambled out of sleep straight into close-range firefights. Artillery officers fumbled for phones and maps, only to realize they weren't sure where the enemy actually was. Machine guns raked black tree lines and hit nothing. By dawn, positions that had seemed solid on the map were gone. Prisoners stumbled to the rear, stunned and filthy, telling the same story. These Americans came at night, and they knew exactly what they were doing. Word traveled quickly through the German ranks. Names of divisions mattered. The American Timberwolf Division had to be treated differently. Files that had described them as untried were hastily amended. Reports carried phrases like experienced in night operations and uses darkness aggressively. Allen did not stop. The pattern repeated along the Mark River in the Netherlands, along the Ruhr, in the bloody hedgerows and villages of the Cologne Plain. Where other divisions begged for more time to plan daylight assaults, the 104th often struck under cover of darkness, using the confusion that paralyzed others as their shield. For a German infantryman crouched in his foxhole, listening to the wind in the trees, that meant something simple and brutal. Under Terry Allen, the Americans no longer respected the one unwritten rule that had kept soldiers sane for centuries. Night was not for rest. Night was another weapon. That is what fear looked like in practice. It wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was the steady erosion of certainty, the inability to trust that you'd get 6 quiet hours before the next bombardment, the creeping knowledge that the Americans across the line had trained specifically to exploit the hours when your own nerves were at their thinnest. The Timberwolves fought their way into Germany with that grim rhythm. Cologne fell. The Rhine was crossed. The rate of their advance stunned observers. Nearly 200 miles in 9 days after one crossing, then another 175 in the next 2 weeks. Speed for the Germans meant something terrifying. Even when they tried to regroup, Allen's men were already there, in the next town, on the next ridge. Then came Nordhausen. Allen's division pushed into the Harz region and stumbled onto one of the ugliest secrets of the Reich, a concentration camp packed with corpses and human beings so starved they could barely lift their heads. The soldiers who had crossed rivers under fire and fought through night defenses thought they had already seen the worst the war could offer. Nordhausen proved them wrong. Terry Allen walked through the camp. He saw the dead stacked like cordwood, the living reduced to skin and bone. He saw what German efficiency, turned to murder, really meant. Whatever faint trace of abstract respect he might have had for the Wehrmacht's tactical skill evaporated. He ordered everything documented. He ordered local German civilians brought to see what had been done in their name. He made them look at the bodies. He made them help bury the dead. It was not mercy. It was a different kind of justice. For his own men, the sight of their general walking through that charnel ground with a set jaw and cold eyes sent a message. The enemy was no longer just a professional opponent. They were servants of a system that had to be destroyed, and they would not be given the courtesy of an easy fight. For German soldiers still in the line, that translated into even fiercer American aggression. The Timberwolves did not become cruel. They did not start shooting prisoners or burning villages for pleasure, but they went about their work of breaking German defenses with a clarity that only comes when you are absolutely certain you are right. At Halle, they fought house by house, room by room, against stubborn defenders. The city might have been reduced to rubble. Instead, something unusual happened. Count Felix von Luckner, a decorated German naval veteran from the First World War, approached under a flag of truce. He negotiated a limited surrender that saved parts of the city from annihilation. Allen, the man accused of being too rough to represent the US Army properly, agreed. He listened to von Luckner, sized him up as a warrior of an older generation, and accepted a deal that spared civilian lives while still taking the objective. That combination, relentless offensive spirit with the ability to stop when it made sense, made him even more dangerous in German eyes. He was not a berserker who would waste his men needlessly. He was a professional killer of armies, not civilians, and he understood exactly when to drive on and when to accept a white flag. By the spring of 1945, when the Timberwolves made contact with Soviet forces on the Elbe, German officers on that front knew the story. They had read reports from units that had tried to hold lines against Allen's divisions in North Africa, in Sicily, in Belgium, in the Ruhr. They might not all remember the details of his biography. They probably didn't know he had failed at West Point, or that he liked to drink, or that he swore like a cavalry sergeant. But they knew this. When Terry Allen trained a division, it arrived in combat already dangerous. When Terry Allen took command of a sector, the nights grew shorter and louder. When Terry Allen put his headquarters somewhere, it meant he expected to hold that ground, no matter what came at him. And when Terry Allen's men got an order, they carried it out, not because they feared punishment, but because they believed their general would never ask them to do something he wasn't willing to stand behind in person with his boots in the same mud. That is why German soldiers feared him, not because he was mythic or superhuman, but because he systematically dismantled the unwritten agreements that all sides quietly make with themselves during long wars. The agreement that there will be time to rest. The agreement that the newest enemy units will be clumsy and hesitant. The agreement that once you have knocked an opponent down badly enough, he will not come back harder. Terry Allen's life after the war contained its share of sorrow. His son, Terry Jr., went to Vietnam, took command of the same battalion his father had once led, and died in an ambush in 1967. The loss crushed the old general. The warrior family tradition that had seemed like a source of pride now cut like a curse. 2 years later, the elder Allen followed his son to the grave. He was buried quietly at Fort Bliss beside the boy who had become a man in the shadow of his father's legend. Back in New York, the academy that had once kicked him out for failing gunnery and math now gives an award in his name to the cadet with the highest standing in military science. It is an irony he might have enjoyed. The school that told him he wasn't the right kind of student now uses him as an example of what the right kind of soldier looks like. But in the end, the real judgment on Terry Allen didn't come from West Point or the Pentagon or Time magazine. It came from the men who fought him and from the ones who followed him into battle, American veterans who served under his command almost always describe the same feeling. He was rough, he was profane, he was far from perfect. But they trusted him. They believed that he cared whether they lived or died, and that he would not abandon them. German veterans who faced the 1st Division in Tunisia and Sicily, and the 104th in the West, remember something just as simple. When he was on the other side of the line, their job got harder, their nights got shorter, their casualty lists grew longer, and their confidence in their own rhythm of war, attack by day, rest at night, push the green Americans around, shattered. For a general, there is no higher compliment from the enemy than this, that they learn your name, and secretly hope they never see it on their situation maps again. Terrible. Terry Allen earned that from the Wehrmacht. He did it with night attacks that turned darkness into his ally, with training that hammered civilians into soldiers, with a refusal to retreat even when the map said it might be sane, and with a kind of leadership that made his own men believe they could do things they had never imagined. And that is why, in the forests and fields of Western Europe, German soldiers came to fear him, not as a legend in a book, but as a very real presence somewhere in the dark, shaping the attacks that woke them out of sleep and reminded them, again and again, that as long as Terry Allen's divisions were in the line, the night belonged to the Americans.